From the darkest corners of the creepy old house down the street to the screams in the night. Settle in, Parafamily, to join with Whitney and Brandon for another spooky episode of the Para-Unity Podcast.
Woo!
Woo!
It never gets old. I love it.
It does.
All right. Well, happy winter season, Para family.
Woo!
Welcome
It's
to
Bridget.
the next episode, newest episode of the Para-Unity Podcast. Well, at this time of year, most folks would prefer to journey south, where it is most of the time warmer. I guess this week has been a little crazy.
It has.
And they want to enjoy those few extra days of sunshine, but not us.
Not us.
No.
No.
No, we are not most folks here at the Para-Unity Podcast. If you haven't learned that already, we are heading further north to the wintry world of New Hampshire to hang out with our friends at Mount Washington Valley Spirit, which is the very short acronym for Scientific Paranormal Investigations, Research, and Interpretation Team. And we will be talking to none other than Eric Extreme.
I cannot wait. This guy is so fun. I'm just so excited. And this winter has just been crazy. It was down into, I know that New Hampshire had its world record breaking temperature drop at Mount Washington.
None other than
what was the final temperature?
-108
Fahrenheit for
Fahrenheit.
our listeners that are in other countries.
Fahrenheit. So if you transferred that to Celsius, it would be too goddamn cold.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so I hope everybody's okay out there. In Virginia, where I am, we were looking at the teens, positive, not negative, but still in the teens.
We were -30, -40
Ugh.
here in Iowa, but that was our wind chill.
It's still unfathomable
That's
to me.
almost normal anymore for winter.
Yeah. And now it's in the 60s.
Yeah, we had almost 50 today. So it was very nice when I went out running last night. It was still like 30 or 20 some degrees out when I went out. So it was pretty groovy.
I am convinced that February is schizophrenic.
That's because I'm born in it.
That explains a lot. Oh, birthday boy.
Next episode.
Yes, next episode. So we're here, but let's think about this episode, right?
Yes, please.
All right. So Mount Washington Valley Spirit is based in a lovely village in Carroll County, New Hampshire called North Conway. And I actually have a friend that has a cabin not too far from this area. So she's shown me pictures and all sorts of things. She decided not to weather that very deep freeze in New Hampshire this past week. She's weathering it in Boston. I don't know if that's much better.
Go south, people. South. We're geese. Fly away.
I dare you to honk like a goose right now. No, don't do it. Anyway.
I cost us enough listeners.
Yeah, that's true. And by the way, thank you all listeners that are here tonight. Please, if you have any questions for our guest or anything like that, please enter it into the chat. But with the caveat, please treat each other respectfully, be cool with each other. And also I banned my kid from the chat. Sorry. He's fine. He's fine. He should be in bed by now anyway.
Well, Whitney, why don't you tell us about North Conway?
I am happy to do so. So as of the 2020 census, the population was around 2,116. And I have a feeling that's just the year-round residents because this whole area is a gorgeous resort area full of all this amazing outdoor activities. So let's go back in time to before the English settled in the area. And this area was the home of the Quaket tribe. who fished, hunted, and farmed along the Saco River. Now, sadly, the tribe's numbers decreased due to exposure to disease, most notably smallpox. And then there was a skirmish in 1725 that resulted in the Pequawket withdrawing from the area. And in 1765, Governor Benning Whitworth chartered the village. Funny enough, Saco River, I've heard of that before. I've heard of that. I've heard of that in relation to some of the other skirmishes that went on up in that area around the time of the Salem witch trials. Refugees from that area came down to Massachusetts. Always fun. But let's not talk about that right now. Let's go on to what draws people to North Conway. And apparently quite a few artists were drawn to the area during the 19th century, and it resulted in tourists coming in and railroad lines being constructed. And these artists formed a group that was known as the White Mountain Art, and it's beautiful. I actually posted a link on it on the show notes, so check it out. It's really beautiful. North Conway is also touted as the birthplace of American skiing, making it a very popular destination for outdoor recreation and outlet shopping, of all things.
Because, you know, those go hand in hand.
They do, actually. I love it.
They do. They do. Well, North Conway is surrounded by natural and rugged beauty, with the White Mountain National Forest to the north and the west of the village, and Mount Washington in the northwest. So people come to the area for skiing, mountain climbing, and hiking, and the Conway Scenic Railroad offers scenic tours of the area. That sounds so super peaceful.
It does sound peaceful. I actually would like to go. Maybe not when it's below zero, but I'd love to go.
I used to ski quite a bit, so now I'd probably just roll.
I did it a grand total of 3 times in my life, and I don't miss it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much beauty here in the environment that perhaps spirits are also attracted here too. So one of the most well-known haunted locations is the Omni Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. So it's a stunning mountain lodge and resort with a gorgeous history of presidents, artists, celebrities, all staying there over its 121-year history. So in 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference was hosted in the hotel, which would result in establishing the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So this is some big deal stuff.
This is an amazing location. I know people that have been here before, and it's just, I think the conference itself was held in something called the Gold Room. And that is actually what put the hotel on the National Register.
Very cool.
Yes.
Well, this hotel was a labor of love for Joseph Stickney and his wife, Carolyn. Perhaps they are still present in the hotel because it is claimed that Carolyn, who later married a French aristocrat and was referred to as Princess, haunts room 314 and walks the halls of the Mount Washington Hotel.
Yes, Carolyn, the staff even to this day refer to her as the Princess, and room 314 is her room. In fact, her bed is still there. It's amazing.
I would get into so much trouble if I ever investigated there. I would, because I cannot deal with people that refer to themselves as royalty.
Oh, she was kind of royalty, though.
It don't matter. I could meet Prince Harry and I would still make fun of him.
I think Prince Harry even makes fun of his own stuff too. Not to. We'll edit that part out.
Nope, probably not. What else do we got, Whit?
Okay, Juggalo. Stark Cemetery, located on Stark Road. It has a really interesting phenomenon that apparently it glows at night. And I'm not sure if there's something in the stones or if it's just the way the moonlight hits it, but it glows. And for those who approach the cemetery, be very careful because it is said a pair of large red eyes will follow you down Stark Road away from the cemetery. And to round it out, let's take a look at another haunted inn called the Inn at Jackson. It was built in 1902 as the summer home for Kate Corinne Baldwin of Baldwin Pianos fame.
Nice.
So the inn is home to unexplained light phenomenon. I'm guessing it's in the form of orbs and lights going on and off, things like that. And apparently there is a resident ghost that goes under the name of Jason. So maybe, just maybe, our guest may be able, I think he's been to the Mount Washington Hotel, and he may have gone to some of these other places too. So why don't we get Mr. Eric Extreme from Mount Washington Valley Spirit on the call right now? And Parafam, let's give him a warm welcome.
Absolutely. Eric, how's it going?
Hey, Eric.
I'm doing. How are you guys?
We're so much happy now that you're here.
I'm just loving the name, my man. Like, it's so much fun to say.
Long story behind that one, huh? Long story.
I like
those
long
are our
stories.
favorite. So let's start this off, Eric. What got you into the paranormal?
Okay, so when I was younger, I started experiencing what I later learned to be a form of matrixing. But I would be, as a youngster, I'd be laying in my bedroom at night, and I'd started having, I don't want to call them hallucinations because I wasn't visually seeing them. It was more of like an impression of like a strong energy in my room. It was freaking me out as a kid. My brain was matrixing it, and matrixing is where your mind tries to make sense out of confusion. There's a part of your brain called the fusiform that does this for us. It's how you could look at like for us in our 40s, you can look at old static television from back in the day, and you can see images while staring at the static. If you look at it long enough, or you might see images in clouds, you might see a bunny rabbit, whatnot. But that's what matrixing is. So back in the day, I was starting to matrix this energy, and eventually I would learn that it was coming from EMF radiation from an unshielded electrical box, but I didn't understand that as a minor. So as a minor, I really started doing all types of research into various phenomenon that was perceived to be paranormal. I was at a pretty large public school at the time, so we had a pretty elaborate library. So I was able to get various books on the paranormal. The vast majority of them were more recounts of people's stories, nothing too scientific. As I got older, I was able to take the city bus around, and I started visiting our local city library, which is absolutely massive. Worcester is where I grew up, down in Massachusetts. It's the second largest city in New England, so we had one heck of a library, second to Boston. And again, I just kept getting all the books that I could get. Back then, when I was younger, we didn't have the internet. That's something that really started to take shape in the mid to late 90s. So before that, if we wanted to look something up, we had to, get our rear ends to the library. It's not something that we could just, ask Siri on our cell phones or our watches. So that just continued, where I just got into the research, and I found myself getting more into the science side of things, trying to explain the who's, what's, when's, where's, and why's, the how's, how this was happening, how your brain may misinterpret certain things. But eventually it was probably about 13, 14 years ago. One of my buddies at the time, I was actually in the professional wrestling business with him. We used to travel the roads together, and he had kind of clandestinely got involved with a local paranormal group. And he didn't know about my history with my research and whatnot. I kind of kept it to myself. It was kind of something I just did on my own. It's something that a lot of people didn't understand. This is prior to the television show. So anytime he talked about such things, you'd get mocked. But anyway, he mentioned that it was something he got involved with. And then I started to let him know about, things that had happened in my past and all the research I was done. And he invited me along to one of their gatherings. And, I started hanging out with them. They were great people. I had fun with them. went on a couple investigations, and I found they were doing more of what you saw on the paranormal television shows like Ghost Hunters International. And for me, I enjoyed my time with them, but I found that I wanted to get more into actual science versus the spooky. It's actually a tagline I use for everything I do. Science comes before the spooky. So I ended up kind of branching off and doing my own thing. You know, I kept in contact with my buddy. We were, you know, good friends for a very long time. He moved and, you know, away, and we lost contact over the years. But I ended up starting my own group, which was science-based. And it's not, you know, a lot of groups claim to do the science, and it's not really what they're doing. But this was actual real, you know, science, a lot of subjects that a lot of people wouldn't even consider in paranormal investigations. And I ended up paying my way, me and my buddy, we paid our way to one of the Ghost Hunter National events. They, back in the day when the show was really popular, they used to hold a lot of events, particularly around the New England area.
Yeah.
And we paid our way to one of them in New York at the Rolling Hills Asylum. And while there, we started doing some of our, you know, experimentations. One in particular we were doing was audio. And Barry Fitzgerald, the leader of Ghost Hunters International, was there. And we kind of caught his attention because we weren't walking around with like K2 meters and doing flashlights and whatnot. We were actually trying to do some scientific stuff off in a corner with audio. And he came over and asked what we were doing, and we explained it to him. And he says, you know, would you guys be interested in helping us out with some investigations? You know, the event was well attended, and there wasn't too many people actually there working as investigators. So Barry invited myself and my buddy to lead some investigations with them for the crowd there. And it went very well. So we ended up getting invited back for multiple events, including the Mount Washington Omni Resort. And we did that for a period of time. And then I kind of had, I don't want to call it a falling out, but a disagreement with the one person in particular who was running these events. Basically, of course, I'm not going to name drop here, but they wanted us to focus more on the theatrical and putting on a show versus the science. And, you know, I felt it was important, you know, to look at both sides of things and not just assume the paranormal, taking into account possible scientific causes, you know, that you'll never see on the television shows. And a couple of us, not just myself and my buddy, but some others left that. We ceased working at these events. And I just continued doing my own thing. And then about 5 years ago, I decided I kind of had my fill of the city of Worcester area. It wasn't the kind town that I grew up in back in the 80s. So I had a vacation home up here in New Hampshire, and I decided to move into it. And so I renamed my group down in Massachusetts. It was actually Extreme Paranormal Investigators Consortium, kind of a corny name that we came up with just so the acronym EPIC would work. Down there, I had a group that was probably about 7 of us actually in that group, and we were pretty making some pretty good waves. You know, we were invited to all the conventions to speak, and always in the local newspaper and whatnot. And up here, I renamed the group to Mount Washington Valley Spirit, and right now it's just myself and my other half, Kristen. I realized years ago that being on the science end of things versus searching for the spooky, I don't need a large team. I mean, there's other people in the area that have reached out, and I've done some coaching with them. But to be honest, I don't do a lot of empirical investigations anymore. It's more of a educational coaching thing that I do. I get tons of emails, phone calls, and whatnot, asking for my opinion from other groups or just from the public in general on things that are going on in that they're perceiving, and they're just looking for a possible scientific cause. That's kind of my jam. That's what I do. And that's what I've been focusing on. You know, I started my own podcast, maybe a little over a year ago, and I do a bunch of episodes at a time. Then I take a break for a couple of months, and I record another bunch of episodes. I last did one maybe about a couple of months ago. I have a couple other things going on in my life I've been focusing on. I figure I'm going on a cruise in a couple weeks. I'll be gone for a couple weeks, and then I figure after I come back, I'll do another round of episodes, maybe 5 to 10 of them. But that's basically, a long story short of how I got into the paranormal field.
Well,
Phew.
whew.
Yeah.
So my curious question then, can you go into what that audio experiment you were doing?
Yeah, I'm curious about that.
All right. So back in the day, there was something called Spiricom. Off the top of my head, I can't think of the gentleman's name who, off the top of my head, who came up with this. So basically what he did is he was using 16 different tones that were similar in frequency to the average male voice. And in the end, his experiments were kind of debunked because he was basically being a magician. It was more a sleight of hand, him throwing his voice is what it basically came down to. However, I was working with the theory of how Spiricom could potentially cause some sort of, how can I word it, like misinterpretation of paranormal activity due to some of the tones following closer towards the infrasound. Infrasound is audio frequencies below 20 hertz, and while none of the frequencies of Spiricom actually fall into that range, when you start taking into account some technical limitations of speakers and how some of the frequencies of audio can be changed when you're dealing, especially with old buildings and metal in the walls. It can kind of alter the frequencies when you get a reverberation effect off of different items in the house, and how that could affect perceived paranormal activity. So that's basically what we're doing over here at the Rolling Hills of Sound. We had some speakers and we're playing some various sounds. It's actually I wish I could tell you the frequencies off the top of my head. I can't think of it. Not that anyone really cares. I'm losing my memory in my old age. Don't get old, guys.
It was George Meek.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And guys, I hate to say it, but science can't do anything about old age.
No.
Yet.
It's gonna happen. Yet.
We try and fight it, but it's eventually a losing battle. Yeah. So this gentleman was doing experiments. Excuse me. He was doing experiments where he was playing these tones, and in his theory, it would help raise energy and kind of give almost like a method for other entities to speak. Although in his actual in-person presentations, it was found that he was always turning around away from the audience when we were hearing these other voices. So, whether there was some real voices or is him doing something, a little clowning around, there's no proof either way, but, anyone with a logical mind will believe, to some extent, he was, kind of playing with the experimentation a little bit and perhaps causing the voices, or maybe throwing his voice or whatnot. So there's no ironclad proof on what he was doing, but that's what we were doing. We were playing with audio when Barry Fitzgerald came over and invited us to work with him.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I got that too. The thing in the throat, it sucks right now. I do have a question. What kind of science were you involved in as you were growing up? Was any kind of scientific field particularly gravitating you? And do you use that work in your paranormal?
Ironically, it was astronomy, believe it or not. From a young age,
astronomy.
Back when I was younger, we used to do a heck of a lot of camping. I came from a family that had very little money, so we couldn't afford to take these lavish vacations. So we would go down to either Rocky Neck State Park in Niantic, Connecticut, or we would come to the White Mountain area, and we would just do a lot of camping. Especially when money was tight, we would just go down to Connecticut. There's not a lot of attractions around there, so it would be just a lot of us entertaining ourselves, going to the beach, bike riding, enjoying nature. So at a young age, my mother and my sister really enjoyed bird watching. So they had some, if I remember correctly, they were 10 by 25 Bushnell binocular. And just one night, out of boredom, we had been playing cards or board games or something. It was a gorgeous night, dark sky. So I just pulled out a beach chair and I grabbed the binocular and I started looking up at the night sky with these binocular. And believe it or not, a 10 by 25 pair binocular can really open up some beautiful deep sky objects if you're in a dark area. Because we were on the coast, the skies are pretty dark down here in southern Connecticut on Long Island Sound. So I started searching the night sky, and then eventually, I went to the library, got some maps. In my early teenage years, my parents were going through a divorce, and my mom didn't have money for a babysitter. So what was going on during the summer is she would bring us up to the Science Center in Worcester. We had a membership there, and I would just start we were hanging around the Science Center basically all day while she worked during the summer. And the staff were really kind. They understood the situation. We all behaved ourselves. We didn't get in any trouble. But there was one gentleman in particular. His name was Dr. Ed Frederick. He's actually retired, living down in Florida now. He was the curator of astronomy at the time. And he started inviting me into his shows, because he saw me hanging around. He introduced himself. And he was probably about the age I am now, at that time, in his 40s. So he would invite me into the planetarium shows and the Omnisphere shows, and then he would invite me into his office, show me all these books and the software he had, and he was teaching me about the night sky. And they had these sky watches at night where they'd invite the public. And then he introduced me to a local astronomy group that happened to meet there in the winter. They would typically meet on Science Center property in another location in another town. They had an observatory up there. So he introduced me to them. And then that became a weekly thing where I started going to this astronomy club. My dad was nice enough to drive me there. And it was not a short drive. It was probably a good 40 minutes in each direction. And he would take me there and come and get me at the end of it. So anywho, I just got involved with them for years, and here it is 30 something years later, and I'm still involved with that astronomy field. Now, did it particularly come into play with the paranormal? Not the astronomy exactly, but the astronomy led me into a different hobby of radio communications. I actually hold the highest level of amateur radio license. It's called Amateur Extra. And I'm actually a test proctor and a field examiner in that field as well. But radio and like astronomy, a lot of comes into play with both of them is electromagnetic radiation, EMF. So with astronomy, I learned a lot about the various forms of EMF, because if you look at those beautiful pictures that you see in magazines or on the internet, of like nebula and galaxies, you're not looking at visual. It's usually a blend of like infrared, ultraviolet, microwave. It's kind of like a collage that they put together, and that's where all those different colors come from. Because if you actually look at objects in the night sky, in most cases they come out gray, or they might have like a tint of light blue or something, but nothing like you see in the photos. So to understand those photos, I really got involved with understanding like ultraviolet and infrared, and microwaves and other wavelengths. And that does come into play when you're doing a real scientific-based paranormal investigation. So that coupled with some of the electronics I learned in radio communications, and now I don't begin to believe that I could I'm no electrician, don't get me wrong. I'm lucky I tie my shoes on some days. But I learned about basic theory and radio principles, which do come into play with paranormal investigations. For an example, how would radio communications come into play with a paranormal investigation? Well, there's, one of the main tools that almost everyone, whether you're a paranormal investigator or a ghost hunter, what they use is a voice recorder. Mm-hmm. And a voice recorder, in general, has what's known as an electric type microphone. It's a MEMS, microelectric. God, now I'm pushing my memory here. But these things can, if you're getting a really expensive device, they can be somewhat susceptible to spurious radio communications. That's why when you buy any electronic device, it'll say this device must receive any type of electric interference or radio interference. And I'll give you an example of how this came to play in a paranormal investigation. some time ago, I received an email from a paranormal investigation group out west, and they believed they had ironclad proof that this woman's house was getting haunted because on a voice recorder they caught a man's voice. And this lady lived pretty secluded. She didn't have any neighbors, within a short distance. And even if someone screamed at the top of their lungs, she would have never heard their neighbor. They were like a mile away. And they believed up and down that they had recorded this man's voice on this voice recorder. So I asked them to send me the audio file, and I amplified it, and I clear as day could hear an amateur radio call sign on this voice. So I'm like, oh, this microphone picked up, some sort of radio signal from an amateur radio operator, possibly nearby. Well, I looked up at the guy's call signal, and he lived like 1,500 miles away. And basically what had happened is this gentleman was doing experimenting with what's known as EME communications. It's Earth, Moon, Earth. It's where you bounce radio signals off the moon to head back to Earth and then talk to someone else who's doing the same thing. It really broadens the range of, radio communications. So basically, this guy had pointed what's known as a beam antenna. It's an antenna that almost similar to a radio dish will point in a singular direction. It doesn't look like a radio dish, but it has the same effect. So he was experimenting with bouncing signals off the moon, and it just happened that some of the signal, due to the frequency he was using, did something called ionospheric radio wave propagation. Long story short, the Earth's sun, and this comes back into astronomy, the Earth's sun has radiation that is emanating from sunspots, and this radiation actually causes an effect in the Earth's ionosphere, which is part of the Earth's atmosphere, which starts around 30 miles up, where the protons separate from the electrons, and the electrons create almost like a mirror to radio signals below 30 megahertz. So what was happening is this guy was trying to bounce signals off the moon, and some of those signals are actually bouncing off the ionosphere and traveled approximately 1,500 miles away and ended up in this, in the region of this person's house. So this cheap voice recorder actually picked this up, and, the paranormal investigation team, without doing any research, assumed the place was haunted, when it turns out it was just a ham radio operator about 1,500 miles away. And, that's where astronomy and radio communications comes into play with paranormal investigation.
Fascinating. I also want to, so for just a moment, let's direct our attention to the chat because we have a couple questions. This is coming from Darren Buss, who's actually going to be a guest of ours in a couple of weeks. Hi, Darren. Good to hear from you. So Darren has one question about how do you feel about using plasma balls and Tesla coils in paranormal investigations? And this is something that we have been seeing a bit lately. So what's your take on that?
It's something I experimented with many, many years ago. This is probably going back at least a decade ago. I actually experimented with this plasma balls and Tesla coils. The theory behind it is you're raising the level of EMF radiation in the room, or creating ionization in the atmosphere surrounding this room. And it's believed by some people in the paranormal field that entities can use this energy to kind of as like a power source for themselves. Now, being this, like I said, I experimented with it. And in my case, I have a unique medical condition. It's actually called, if I can get this properly, it's gastroesophageal nervosa tactile hyperesthesia. Basically, I have an overactive nervous system that came from a fever as a kid. So my nervous system is overactive. It picks up a lot of things. It causes a lot of matrixing, and it very much limits what I can eat and certain things I can do in life. But I found, because of my tactile hyperesthesia, when I played anything with Tesla coils or plasma balls or anything that can increase the ionization in the room, it actually made me feel like I was getting electrocuted because of my tactile hyperesthesia. Now, scientifically, that sort of thing for people who are susceptible to it, it can cause hallucinations, just like infrasound, the sound frequencies below 20 hertz. So it's twofold. You have your people who believe, and I can't say it from experience because I've never experienced this part of it, where people believe that, it can act as a power source for an entity to, manifest itself in some form, whether audibly or visually, or tactilely. But on the science side of things, I've found that it can cause, the misinterpretations, the hallucinations. I'm not saying in any stretch of the imagination that that's 100% of the time what's going on. I'm just saying in my own personal experience, that was going on. And like I said, that comes into play with my tactile hyperesthesia medical condition that I have. But it's something that it's funny because I haven't done many empirical investigations lately myself. I have multiple things going on, and my little time that I have with this, I've been focusing on educating others. But one of the experiments I want to do is I have a whole slew of scientific devices at my disposal here. I probably have, I'm going to say somewhere close to 8 to 10 grand worth of electronic equipment. And those are what he asked about is something I want to really start investigating again. But I can do it at a distance. Like I can set it up in, say, my shed out back, and then read the readings from my house inside the house, because technology allows us to do that now. So it's something I definitely want to experiment with when I get a little more time, when it's not 20 degrees below zero outside and I'm not going to freeze.
Yeah, that's a thing.
Well,
Darren,
one of the things, hold on. One of the things that I've been hearing from different teams that have been diving into like the ionization of the air is a lot of them are finding similarities with the fact that before they have some kind of paranormal event occur, whether it's an apparition or a noise like a knock or a footstep or a voice or something like that, they're seeing a uptick in the ionization of the air right beforehand, and then right as or right after this occurs, there's a huge discharge of the ionization. So I think that's why a lot of those plasma balls and Tesla coils are really starting to come into play now, because they're actually starting to see that this could be possibly some kind of, I don't want to say it, not necessarily a trigger, but a precursor.
Something to kind of throw into it as like a catalytic experiment.
Exactly. And it, like I said, it's an experiment that I want to get into as time permits. I'm when it's not 20 degrees below zero outside. Oh my God. It's been so cold up here, guys. Thankfully,
we feel your pain.
Thankfully, this was only for a couple days this time around. 4 or 5 years ago, one winter, it was negative 20 degrees for over 2 weeks.
Yeah,
we get that here.
So much heating fuel. Yeah. But needless to say, on my side of things, because I'm the science geek, I'm gonna be more interested in the way that electrostatic or ion balance affects human perception of what's perceived to be paranormal activity versus the paranormal activity itself. And that's just something that I've really fallen into, in my career, as I focus more on the science than the spooky side of things. Right. So there's tons and tons of people out there doing the spooky, and there's not so many people doing the science. So I figure what time I do have to aid the field as a whole in its research, it would be better suited focusing on the science side of things. Not to say I don't find the spooky entertaining. I mean, I watch some of the shows just like everyone else, but empirically, when I'm doing it myself, I like to focus on the more technical side of things, because there's not a lot of people doing that anymore. If you look at the history of the paranormal investigation field, it actually dates back, I want to say, about 120, 130 years.
Yeah, there are.
Back in the day, before these television shows came around, a lot of the people involved in the field were actual scientists. Like, these teams are scientists or people with some sort of specialization. And, these people who do these TV shows, I've worked with them. They're great people. I love spending time with them. I still keep in contact with a few of them. They're not putting on what an actual paranormal investigation is. That's not what you're seeing on TV. You're seeing kind of like a TV, glamorized ghost hunt, because that's what people are going to tune in to watch. And a lot of what's going on in the field now, where people, who aren't on the science side of things. I'm not saying everyone. I'm saying, you know, this is a niche thing, but there's people who are just basically mimicking what they see on TV. And there's definitely room for that, because you can't just focus completely on the science either. I do personally, because it's my personal niche, but you know, you need people on both sides of the spectrum, because you can't always explain everything with science. You know, I've had one or two experiences that no way in heck will I ever be able to explain with science. It's, you know, it's one of the few times, you know, that I've actually be willing to say something was paranormal. And the one, if you want me to tell a quick story on that particular instance, it was actually one of the events over at the Rolling Hills Asylum in New York. I was leading an investigation with Barry Fitzgerald, and we were actually teaching. We during these seminars, we'd actually teach some skill sets for, you know, budding investigators, you know, so they could actually learn various things that you'll never see on the TV shows, because the TV shows very much limit on education, because they're more focused on viewers, and no one's going to sit there, you know, in the general audience and watch an actual investigation. It's a lot of hours of boredom. So we were teaching about various forms of spirit communication. There was about 15 people in the room sitting around me in a semicircle, and Barry's just kind of sitting off to the side as I'm doing my spiel. And we're doing we're discussing various methods of spirit communications in different ways to possibly get people's attention, you know, like playing music from the time of, you know, the perceived the existence of the entity you believe that you're trying to make contact with. Or, you know, if it's colonial times, you start using colonial vernacular, that sort of thing. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, I hear a voice, and I thought it was just, you know, myself matrixing, because, you know, with tactile hyperphagia, you know, often it's not just limited to visual or tactile. You actually, your brain will perceive things as audio when it's not really there. So I ignored it at first, and then again, it was this raspy voice, and everyone started looking at me, and I was like, okay, it's not just me. So we started asking questions, and we started getting these raspy answers, you know, and I'm looking around to make sure that there's no one throwing their voice. You know, it's not too hard with a little practice to do a little ventriloquism. Anyone can learn how to do it. So Barry and I are looking around, and there's no one there doing it. I mean, I had asked everyone to turn off any devices that they had. You know, everyone had a K2 meter or a voice recorder or something, and I wanted to make sure that those weren't influencing anything. So they put all those away. So we continued this for quite some time, where we're asking questions, trying to learn what this entity is. And basically, it turned out it was... with the questions, like I said, they were all short, raspy answers, almost like someone was struggling to speak. And we learned that it was something attached to the area and not the building itself. The answers were so short and brief that we weren't able to get a ton of information about it. But, you know, being the science guy, you know, I tried to debunk it. It is a term, you know, typically used in the paranormal field, where you try and explain something with natural causes. I go a little deeper than that into the science. So, you know, after the class got out, I was looking around, and in the building in the general area, I'm actually using a night vision infrared camera, not a visual one, but an actual FLIR camera. And I'm holding it up to the walls, looking for piping, because that can carry voices. I'm looking for cavities in the wall, because that can carry voices too within a building. And there just wasn't one. This was like a solid brick room, and there just wasn't the cavities. There wasn't the old pipes. This was just like an old room higher up in the facility. I used every device that we had there, trying to find a scientific cause for it, and I couldn't come up with it. And that alone would be enough for a lot of people to say something's paranormal, but it wasn't for me. Ironically, a couple days later, I was at home. About 2 days later, we had gone back. The next day we went back from New York to Massachusetts, me and my buddy. And the day after that, I'm hanging out with a female friend of mine. She invited me to her place. She had just moved, and she wanted to show me the new house. So we're walking around outside, and this girl I knew was intuitive. Her name is Sandra, and she goes, "Who's so-and-so?" And I'm sorry, it's been so many years, I don't remember the name, but it was the same name that came up during the DVP. It's not EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, because it wasn't electronic, it was direct voice phenomenon. But it was the same name that came up in the DVP session. And I'm like, where did you get that name? And I hadn't told her about the event I had just attended, so I knew that she wasn't searching online for things that I was doing, because at that point I still wasn't really broadcasting to my friends what I was doing. It's just a small circle of people in the field, but not my close friends or acquaintances. They didn't know what I was doing. And she goes, well, it just seems like it's an energy that's with you right now. She says, I can't say it's like something intelligent, but it's almost something residual with you. And it was the same name that came up in the DVP session. It wasn't just like John or Jack. It was, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name. I asked Barry Fitzgerald recently. He couldn't remember the name either, because it's been so many years, but it was the same name. So it's like, okay, so I have this event that happened in front of 15 people where I was having a discussion with something that appeared to be about 4 or 5 feet away from me, but there was no one there. This voice was coming from this vacant area. And where I tried to write that off, now here I am with someone intuitive who comes up with this unique name that came up during the DVP session. And it's like, okay, I have enough here to that I'm willing to entertain that something paranormal happened that, science couldn't explain. Did that stop me from trying to explain it with science? No. Here we are 13 years later, and I've pretty much exhausted every science I could come up with. So it's one of the very few times where I'm willing to say something paranormal happened, and I was not able to explain it with science in some form, even, in any stretch of the imagination.
Sure. Well, one question that kind of goes alongside with your DVP sessions. What would you say is the best program that you would use for like when you're doing your EVP or DVP sessions to amplify them?
See, what I typically use is you'll actually see these on some of the paranormal TV shows. It's a Zoom 360 H4N Pro audio recorder. But I record in a raw format. The actual raw format, especially with paranormal investigations, you want to avoid MP3 because it uses compression. And with compression can come audio artifacts. And I use it with a microphone that's, oh God, what's it called? It's a binaural. Yeah, it's a 3DO free space binaural microphone, it's called. It literally looks like a pair of human ears, but it's meant to, electronically as electronic as possible, pick up sounds as a human would hear it. And so I have this connected to the Zoom audio recorder. And I literally just download the file and play it straight out from the raw file, unedited, uncompressed. These files are literally huge. I mean, you're going through large amounts of data in a short period of time because it's in a raw format, multiple channels. So honestly, I don't use other types of software because, especially if you're doing MP3 or most of those different formats use forms of compression. So I just listen to the raw audio straight from an audio player on my Apple computer. And I leave it at that. If you need to amplify something, I literally just use the equalizer within Apple Music. Mm-hmm. It just increases the decibels. That's all I do. I don't like to use any modifications or any type of software that really starts to play with the original format, because that's when you can start getting artifacts in there that could easily be misinterpreted as paranormal. So I literally keep it as simple as possible.
Sounds good. And actually, excuse me, God, my throat's all over the place today.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, tell me about it too. So one thing that is interesting that I want to go back to is your passion right now is involving education. So yes. What would be some of the skill sets that you have been sharing with students in terms of anyone getting into the paranormal?
Now, being on the science side of things, I don't aim towards, with television, you're basically talking about hysterics. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not a bad way to go. I mean, you got to have your fun while you're doing this, because if most people would be bored silly if they did things the way I do. But with me, I suggest to people that they learn about infrasound in particular. Infrasound being, sound frequencies below 20 hertz. Infrasound, for those who are unaware, can be generated naturally by thunderstorms, in particular what's known as a Schumann resonance that occurs up in the atmosphere, where infrasound gets stuck between the air currents of the storm and the ionosphere, gets amplified. So if you actually have an infrasound analyzer, it actually will sound as nature's heartbeat. Animals, there's certain animals that can do it too. Elephants, rhinoceros, they actually use it in packs, and it's been scientifically found that this sound can actually travel hundreds of miles. Other natural occurrences of this, it can be caused by fans, generators, anything with a spinning motor. It can happen during minor earthquakes, and it occurs naturally in other avenues. But anyway, so I use a infrasound analyzer. It's actually called an Infotech Infra 20 infrasound monitor. Now, how does that come into play with paranormal investigations? Well, infrasound, being below 20 hertz, there's a lot of scientific proof that shows it can cause various situations with humans, where it can cause like hallucinations. It can cause you to hear things that aren't there. It can cause headaches, eye pain, the feeling of being watched, which is known as scopesthesia. I also recommend people become more familiar with ultrasound, which are frequencies above 20,000 hertz. While not as prevalent as the causes of infrasound, ultrasound can do similar things. A quick example of both. With infrasound, I had an investigation, if I can call it that. It was more of a consultation that happened several months back, where an elderly woman had reached out to a paranormal investigation group out of the area, and she actually lived in a town right nearby here, because she was experiencing the feeling of being watched, scopesthesia. She was getting ear pain, headaches. And she had talked to her doctor, and the doctor couldn't come up with a cause. They did MRIs, and there was just no scientific, medical evidence of what was going on. So she reached out to this group, and they just came up with a slew of reasons why her place was haunted. And she wasn't completely convinced, and someone, put her in contact with me. So I got her on the phone, and I started asking questions related to her symptoms. I'm a certified EMT and certified pharmacy technician from previous careers, long time. So I have some basic knowledge about, medicine, nothing like a doctor or any stretch of imagination, but enough to be able to, bring it into the paranormal field somewhat. But anyway, I started asking her various questions that related to infrasound. And to make a longer story short, I found that she was using an old metallic fan to help circulate air in the house. And you can see where this is going.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Exactly. So I had suggested that she turned off this fan because the human eye resonates around 18 hertz. So with infrasound being below 20 hertz, it can actually cause eye pain and headaches. So she turned off the fan, but that doesn't completely explain the scopesthesia, because the scopesthesia was on the other side of her condo where the fan wasn't anywhere near. Now, infrasound can easily travel, but it just wasn't that loud, to go through that many walls to affect her the way it was. So that came down to scopesthesia. I had asked her if she moved anything around, and it turns out she was cleaning out her closet, and there were boxes everywhere. So I suggested to her that the light coming in through the window was being perceived differently when she was in her bedroom because of these stacks of boxes everywhere. And it was causing her the feeling of being watched due to acute claustrophobia, the fear of enclosed spaces. So I suggested that she move all these boxes back into the closet. And I was pretty sure between that and the fan, all of her symptoms would go away. And sure enough, they did. With ultrasound, I basically came across a case where similar symptoms, but it turned out it was being caused by one of those plug-in pest devices. Those are ultrasound. Neon lights can cause infrasound. Those bar lights that you see in some of the stores that aren't LEDs, those can cause ultrasound too. Beyond those two, I always, I instruct people about proper usage of FLIR thermal cams, not necessarily using them as like an entity camera, but using them to find rodents in walls, looking for cavities in walls, looking for piping in walls, because you'd be surprised what those things can do. Another long story short, there was another paranormal case consultation I did for a group, and it basically turned out that this person was swearing up and down that they were hearing voices of a deceased relative because of the name that they kept hearing was that of a deceased relative. And I was able to prove that the sound was actually coming through a bathroom vent. It was the audio from a little girl playing nearby, and her friends was getting amplified in an interesting way because the ductwork came off at different directions going through this house. It was kind of like, it wasn't done professionally. It looks like it was almost done by someone who really didn't know what they're doing. But this audio, was making this person believe that the place was haunted, and it wasn't. But that's what I instruct people with the FLIR thermal cam, to kind of think outside the box and try and find causes of what's being perceived as paranormal activity. I instruct people on using gas detectors to search for things like carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, combustibles. These are gases that can cause misperceptions. Air quality detectors that'll find, formaldehyde, natural and synthetic volatile compounds, dust particulate matter, another thing that can cause hallucinations. I touched base on electrostatic and ion balance earlier. I use microwave detectors. I explain to people how microwaves can affect people and why you should have a microwave detector. I'm not talking necessarily about the thing in the kitchen, but You'd be surprised, how many different entities in the federal government uses it. Like Mount Washington, they use it to stay connected to their old Discovery Center. They use microwave communications because that can get through just about any storm. It's not affected greatly because of the frequency. It's way, way, way up in the gigahertz range. I get into people, I instruct them on using stuff like Geiger counters to find alpha, beta, gamma, and X-ray radiation. Now, while that's more rare than the others, I've seen a couple cases over the years where people buy random stuff off the internet and you don't know where it came from. Alpha radiation will get absorbed by almost anything. That won't even break the skin. But once you get into beta radiation, it can start affecting you. So say hypothetically, and this is more hypothetical than practical, say you buy some gemstones like amethyst or, some raw gemstones like crystals off the internet. And what if it just happened to come from a place that was radiated at one point in a war? Little bits of this radiation could cause misperceptions. I get into weather phenomenon, how like wind, precipitation, temperature, humidity, air pressure, that sort of thing can cause misperceived paranormal activity. Various forms of the electromagnetic spectrum. Particularly, what a Faraday bag is, using those devices to block out radio signals from interfering with equipment. So that's what I do a lot of educating on is, and I'm not saying there's no such thing as paranormal activity. Like I said, I've had my own experiences, but for me, I want to be able to rule out the normal before I entertain the thought of something being paranormal. And back in the day, that's with the limited technology before these TV shows, that's what a lot of these groups did. And it's kind of shied away from that more for the entertainment value versus a scientific value. So what I focus on is trying to re-educate people, not to completely, get away from their preferred method, but to incorporate science, because you can't just go into place with a voice recorder and say, oh, that's definitely paranormal. It's like, well, you didn't do any work on explaining any type of science. So how can you say it's paranormal if you haven't ruled out the normal? You got to make some effort here. And the equipment I use is readily available on the internet. I mean, it's not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, but if you're going to, I'd rather see someone buy an infrared detector instead of a bear that, an interactive bear that lights up when it picks up any type of EMF radiation, if you know what I mean. A lot of these devices I use are in the same price range, so I teach people about learning the devices that you're actually using and what they're scientifically capable of, and keeping that in mind when you're choosing what money you spend equipment on. So that's basically what I do. I get I'm not so well known as I used to be back in the day when I first got into this in the New England area, but there's enough people that know my name from my interviews and whatnot that they reach out to me and ask me a lot of questions. And I'm not a know-it-all. There's things I don't know. But what I've done over the years is, being in the astronomy field, in the radio communication field, is a lot of people associated with those hobbies that have extra letters at the end of their name because they have college degrees that I don't have. I just have a high school diploma. So, I have colleagues in those groups that are like biologists, astronomers, physicists, doctors, psychiatrists. They have all these college degrees. So when I get these situations that come up, and if I don't know the answer, I'll consult with them for potential scientific causes, and I present it as potential, not as this is the definite cause, unless I have indisputable evidence that it's scientific. But I focus on giving potential scientific causes, just so to kind of even off all of the focus on the spooky that you see out there now, thanks to the way the field's kind of gone with the television shows over the past 15 years.
So another question that popped up in the crowd here was, what do you think of using tuning forks? So like getting into like the chime or the vibration during sessions.
I've never personally used them. However, one of the groups I used to be somewhat affiliated with, we kind of bounced experiments and ideas off of each other, kind of just like throwing things up against the wall to see what sticks. I know they got involved with something like that, and they were telling me about it. I would never say not try something. Most of humankind's, a lot of the great inventions we have today came from accidents. Or they were researching one thing and it turns out that it would work for something else. So if I personally use tuning forks, no. I know some of the tuning forks have been known because it's metallic that can fall down into the infrasound range, which, like I said before, can cause misinterpretations. But, there's still people out there who believe, and it can't be disproven either way. I think it has some merit to some extent that, it could help raise the vibration or the energy in the room and potentially give an entity something to draw energy off of, if that's something that's possible. Like I said, it could go either way. I don't have an opinion either way on it. But when it comes to tuning forks and other such devices, like we discussed earlier, I want people to experiment as much as they can with these things, because you're taking your investigation to a level that goes beyond just trying to record paranormal activity. You're actually getting into science when you're using those devices, believe it or not. And I just wish more people would document it, and like we had a central nexus where we could submit all this information to, instead of people just publishing it on their individual websites. And you kind of got to Google things, and there's no actual real scientific method being used per se, where you can really solidify their results. But I recommend to everyone that they experiment with such things and find some way of publishing your data, because if enough people do it, if enough people can prove the same thing over and over, it gives more credibility to what we do as a whole.
Well, that could be a good project for you for surviving through the cold weather, is creating that online consortium.
It's funny. I have an acquaintance of mine who actually really helped with my own education when I got into the field. His name's Doug Kelly. He lives down in I want to say it's Punta Gorda, Florida. He had tried to do something like that. It was called Paranexus, where he got a lot of the people like me who were really involved with the science side of things, and he got them together. Unfortunately, it didn't gel the way he had hoped. I made some contacts that really have benefited me with my own research and my own education into the field, because we don't have paranormal school. You can't go to school. You can get some paranormal type classes, but there's no degree school where you can go and get a paranormal degree. So you're taking your education from various sources, and some people prefer more of the hysterics, the TV version. You may find people like a David Roundtree or a Doug Kelly, who are more on the science side of things, and that's the avenue I went down. But it's funny you mention that, because it's something that's come up in another interview before, and I think eventually I want to try doing that again. The problem, in doing something like that would be beneficial to those who are interested. in such things, but your general, that's going to be more of your more serious ghost paranormal investigators. It's not going to really be beneficial for your ghost hunters who are just doing it, for the thrill of the hunt, or that adrenaline rush from the spooky. So I've talked about possibly writing a how-to book one day with some of these other guys, or just do it myself for those who are really interested in the science, because I've looked and there's just really no source of information out there for people who are interested in the science in the paranormal field. You kind of got to pull the science from different types of fields around the globe. You got to pull your radio and EMF from one place. You got to pull your infrared and infrasound from another. There really is no center area to research all these things. There's been a couple people who've written some books that touch on it, but they were using those books to make a side income for themselves. So they focused more on what would sell more books. So I figure I'll end up writing a book someday. I thoroughly enjoy writing. I've done some magazines before where I wrote some articles. And I think it would be beneficial for myself, to work with others with the same mindset to kind of, bring basically like an encyclopedia of science that comes into play during paranormal investigations for those who are interested, kind of like a reference book that people can bounce their evidence up against to see, if there's a possible scientific explanation for something that they're perceiving to be paranormal.
Yeah, and actually we do it from what it looks like on the chat tonight. We've had people like Darren Buss that has interest in science orientation. We've also had a few people like Chad Wandell, who deals a lot with robotics. Remember Chad?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I talk to him
also,
all the time.
yeah, and also CPRI, based here in Virginia, they do a great deal with the science-based as well, especially when it comes to soil analysis and how soil radiation can affect paranormal activity and perceptions of the paranormal too. So you're definitely not alone out there.
The stone tape theory comes into play with what you just mentioned right there. The stone tape theory being, people believe, especially with like limestone and quartz, they have the ability to absorb energy. I mean, science has shown this to be true. And whether it comes down to matrixing or it's actually almost replaying, absorbed human energy from like a traumatic experience over and over again. So I'm now that you mention that, I've heard of them before. But that soil thing that they're doing is not something that's been really looked too much in depth. So that's something I want to see some of their results, because I'd be very interested in to see what they've come up with.
I'll pass along some contact information if you're interested.
No, I definitely appreciate that.
Sure.
See, and then on my side of it, I look at some of the science, but I get more into like the psychological side of it.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm a historian. So that gets me into geology, and it also gets me into archaeology too.
See, my other half, Kristen, she's huge into the geology. We call her the gemstone princess because she knows more about gemstones and some of the people that we see at these gemstone shows. Mm-hmm. So that's her jam side of things. Now, what type of psychological side do you get into in particular?
So I look at the psychological aspects of it, how certain things in the environment are affecting the psychology, how people are thinking, how they're mentally like looking to self-manifest things. That whole theory behind, where the group manifestations can react or can cause the environment around them to react to the mutual thought process. So like the Tulpa experience or experiments that people do, where they do the group mental manifestations. I also look at the sociology side. Is there bigger things where in the society, like, are we looking at more of this type of economic class are experiencing more things in where they're living? Is it caused by the stresses in their life? Is it caused by the living conditions? Or is it, all sorts of different things like that. So
Cool.
I come from a law enforcement background for years. So I've always been the people person. I look at the paranormal, but I look at the people that are leading to it. Like, I have a very good ability to look at somebody or listen to somebody when they're talking to me and be like, yeah, you're full of it. Or as opposed to, okay, you're legitimately feeling something or seeing something. I want to go in there and see if I can see it and feel it too, and see if I can figure out, is this something playing out in your head, or is this something actually playing out in the environment?
Yeah. Have you done anything related to what's it called, cryptomancia, which is like a forgotten memory that can be perceived as paranormal activity? Or
Yes.
there's the vus, deja vu, jamais vu, presque vu.
Mhm.
There's oh God, there's the Mandela effect. False memory.
Mandela.
And then with psychology, you're getting into recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, RSPK. I mean, it's a field of its own that you're interested in. We need people like you who are really digging into that. One person cannot focus on everything. There's just too much. So it's good to have people with various specialties.
Well, and the craziest thing is that nexus that you were talking about, that your friend from Florida did. That sounds super, super familiar. Yeah. So, do you remember when he was doing that?
12, 13 years ago it peaked. I mean, it was a point where people were blogging. There was message boards. I think the website's still actually up. It's been inactive for years, but I think he keeps it up for research purposes. But this is going back about 12, 13 years. He had an online school where he taught paranormal stuff, and he still does it. I personally want to charge people to, get a degree. I can understand charging people to instruct them. I completely support that. The guy's got to make a living, and he's put hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of hours into these curriculums, and they're actually somewhat beneficial, for a whole wide variety of things. I may not agree with, him giving a metaphysical degree for it, but, that's not my thing. It's done through a metaphysical church, but he really, not necessarily just himself, but he's put together some people that have put together these curriculums that can be beneficial. But there's tons of them. I mean, he's got dozens and dozens and dozens, which is why I think it'd be beneficial if we did a book on, maybe a 150-page book, something people can just read in a couple sittings and use as a reference book for all this stuff.
I swear I came across it, or I know something about it, that it's, as soon as you mentioned it, it just popped right there.
He also did a podcast that had, oh my God, I want to say close to 200 episodes. It's called Paranormal Universe. And it was everything from paranormal to ghost hunting to ufology to psychic phenomenon to everything across the anomalous. It wasn't just paranormal, it was everything across anomalous research. And unfortunately, you can't find that on like Apple iTunes or anything like that anymore. Apple Store, it's long gone. However, if you're familiar with archive.org, it's the Wayback Machine. They actually have an archive of old podcast episodes, and all of his old episodes called Paranormal Universe are on there. And some of them, are actually extremely educational and informative. So if it's something you're interested in, look in the podcast section of archive.org. It's called Paranormal Universe, and there's some stuff from all over the anomalous research field to even cryptozoology that he did, where he spoke to the best of the best in the fields. So if anyone's really interested in that sort of thing, I highly suggest that they find Paranormal Universe, because that's what he did. He did an amazing job. Unfortunately, it just, he was using the field to really supplement his income, and he kind of had to go in a different direction from that whole Paranexus aspect, because it wasn't allowing him to put food on the table. So he went in a different direction, but he was really on a path that I think would be extremely beneficial if someone took the time and money to put something like that together again.
For sure. I agree with you 100%. Well, Eric, what are the best ways for people to get a hold of you if they want to pick your ear more on it or talk to you about some advice or need help with something?
Well, everything's done. All links back to mwvspirit.com, Mount Washington Valley Spirit. It's just an acronym, mwvspirit.com. Like I said, I have a podcast. Again, it's called Mount Washington Valley Spirit. You can find it on basically any podcast directory on the planet. It's more of an educational podcast. It's not meant for entertainment. It's not me interviewing other people. It's literally all science stuff. It's a good educational source. I'm pretty much on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. It's all under Mount Washington Valley Spirit or at MWV Spirit.
Fantastic. Yay. Well, definitely a lot of things to think about. And I can definitely tell you that quite a few people are definitely going to reach out to you very soon, Eric. I have this feeling. So
by all means. And like I said, if something's over my head, I have my network of people with the advanced science degrees. I can at least put in scientific 2 cents. And like I said, it's never 100%. It's just a scientific possibility, not a certitude. But it doesn't hurt to look at the science side of things.
Let's see about the scientific possibility of the weather getting a little better for you guys up there.
Oh my God, that's why I'm going on a cruise in 2 weeks.
Oh God.
I gotta get to the tanning bed a couple times in the next couple of weeks so I don't glow in the dark. I had no sun here.
Bioluminescence.
Oh my God, I'll be naturally my skin's a little darker from my heritage, but it's like comparatively, it's like I tried to put on shorts the other day and it's like I need a pair of sunglasses. I'm so pale. So yeah, I gotta hit the tanning bed a couple times so people on the cruise ship don't go blind.
Well, remember, plenty of sunscreen.
Yes.
Yeah, I might lose my hair.
And on that note, please enjoy your cruise, and thank you, Eric Extreme and Mount Washington Valley Spirit, for being our guest tonight. And
thanks for having me on.
Yeah, our pleasure.
This was very entertaining. Most of my interviews aren't this jovial. I appreciated the lightheartedness of it.
Yay, thank you. We appreciate that too. And believe me, I will send you some history stuff that you'll really get a kick out of, I think.
I'd love it.
I'm a historian. And speaking of history, folks, if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, please remember to take a second to rate us 5 stars or leave us a review. We will see it, and it will go down in history to help us get the word out about the show. And we appreciate your feedback. It helps to make the show better.
Yes, it does. And if you're an Android listener, you can follow us on Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, or Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Remember, if you like the show, tell a friend. If you want to be a guest on the show or just want more Para-Unity, please join us on our Facebook or Instagram pages. Whitney, I did not forget about you. You can also just simply say, Alexa, play the Para-Unity podcast. And she'll go, okay, playing. So,
she does not sound like that. Talk about throwing your voice. You need to practice that.
I forgot to go like this. Yeah, anyways. So if you want to help support the show, please stop by our website and buy us a coffee. Well, my name is Brandon.
And I'm Whitney, and we've been listening to the best place to bring our paranormal family a little closer together, the Para-Unity Podcast. Good night, everyone.